Thank you everyone for joining us today in the fourth of our 5-part How to Get Published series with our publisher partner, Taylor and Francis. This initiative is co-hosted by the North America and Latin America and the Caribbean hubs of EURAXESS worldwide. I'd like to open with a few quick comments on the format for today. My colleague Daria and I make up the EURAXESS North America hub, and we are based in the United States. She is running the show behind the scenes, and if you are a researcher based in the US or Canada, we are your point people to learn more about research. Europe is a research destination and to support you in your career development. Our colleague from the EURAXESS LAC hub is here based in Brazil. The whole EURAXESS LAC team is based in Mexico and Brazil, and they cover all of Latin America and the Caribbean. They will host the 5th and final webinar in this series featuring a panel of editors on October 26th. You'll get a follow-up message from us with a link to register for that as well. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and shared afterwards. We will occasionally share some links and messages using our chat feature. So if you don't see any incoming chat messages and you're viewing this in your web browser, please just refresh the page. And then finally, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature, which I will moderate after the main presentation. So after a brief introduction to the EURAXESS services, you will hear from Dr. Diana Marshall, the head of reviewer programs at Taylor and Francis Group. And with that, I'd like to jump in and explain our work. So EURAXESS is a European Commission initiative that promotes researcher mobility and career development. Our main aim is to share with you European funding opportunities, provide support to researchers in a variety of forms, including via information dissemination, trainings, webinars like this one, and much more. The EURAXESS hubs outside of Europe allow us to serve as your point of contact to get connected with or stay connected to Europe, as well as look for host institution or partners in Europe. So we aim to help you better understand the European Commission funding and learn in depth about the many grants, fellowships, and job postings funded by the EU. The EURAXESS national portals throughout Europe provide country-level expertise. So if you know a particular nation you're interested in moving to or researching with, EURAXESS service centers there will help you learn about the logistical matters so you can spend more of your time focusing on the research and rest assured that you have a support system before you even make the move. And then in closing, regardless of your nationality, research field, or career stage, if you are based anywhere in the Americas, our other 2 EURAXESS hubs, our 2 total EURAXESS hubs are designated to serve you. So we encourage you to be in touch with us and with any questions and comments so we can get to know you better and shape our activities and content around the needs of our members. So I'm leaving you here with a very quick overview of the main sections of the EURAXESS website. So the jobs and funding section is our bread and butter. It's where you'll find postings reviewed by the European Commission. Anything that receives Commission funding is there. We have a partnering tool on hosting where you can find a host institution if you already have a grant or a grant application or fellowship application you'd like to make. Plenty of free career development tools, quizzes, and resources. And then I mentioned before those EURAXESS Europe individual offices within each country. They are there to provide a lot of assistance, as well as us EURAXESS worldwide hubs. There's 9 total now, which you can see here. And we're very happy to be here today on behalf of EURAXESS North America and EURAXESS LAC. So we'll jump to our main presentation right now. I'd like to welcome our speaker. Dr. Diana Marshall works on projects to support editors in finding suitable peer reviewers and ensuring best practice in peer review, both through improving processes and developing training in how to be a peer reviewer. Prior to joining Taylor and Francis, Diana was a publisher for the DMC series journals at Biomed Central and has worked in a variety of editorial roles. Before making the move into publishing, Diana gained a PhD in plant biology from the University of Cambridge. So with that, let me transition Diana to you as the presenter. So bear with me a moment, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll just get the right screen share going. So yes, I will also turn off my webcam during the presentation. So don't be surprised if you suddenly can't see me anymore. It's just to save bandwidth so you can get hopefully a really clear audio connection. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today to talk about how to be an effective peer reviewer. A couple of other quick technical things before we get into the presentation. In your GoToWebinar kind of panel probably on the right-hand side of your computer screen, you should have a series of links, one of which hopefully says handouts. Do open that up and have a look and download the handouts which are present. There's 3 PDFs there. there's a reviewer checklist that we will be referring to during the webinar. You'll find some example reports which you can look at later, and also a summary of the slides from today's webinar. I will also be using the poll functionality for some multiple choice questions at a couple of points during the presentation. When I indicate that a poll is in progress, please do click to select your choice of answer. Now, I know that in the poll functionality in GoToWebinar doesn't always work perfectly with all web browsers. It doesn't always work brilliantly with mobile devices. So if you can't participate in a poll, don't worry. It's not compulsory, it's not a test. It doesn't matter if you can't click on anything, but I always really love to hear the views of those on the call. So if you can, then do participate when it comes up. So with those little technical bits out the way, let's get started on our session on how to be an effective peer reviewer. So during our webinar today, we're going to be going through the steps that are involved in the peer review process from the perspective of a reviewer, from things to think about before you even receive an invitation through to actually how you're completing your review. So let's start at the very beginning with an idea of some of the things to think about before peer review, starting off with what is this peer review process that you're getting yourself involved with. So here is a summary of the main elements of the peer review process. Different journals will have slightly different approaches, but most of the key aspects are the same. The process starts when the author submits their article to a journal for assessment. There'll be some initial checks to make sure that the article fulfills the basic requirements of the journal and that all the required information is included. If those checks are okay, then the editor will usually make an initial assessment on whether the article is suitable for peer review. If the editor has any concerns or feels that the article is not suitable for that journal, then they would reject it at this point. But if they feel that the article can proceed, then it will be sent to reviewers. And there's normally at least 2 reviewers who give comments on an article, and they are selected to be independent experts. Once the reviewers have made their assessment, the article goes back to the editor with their comments, and the editor then makes a decision on whether the authors need to revise their article, whether it should be rejected, or whether it is suitable for publication. And I should say that very few articles are suitable for publication immediately. In most cases, there will need to be at least some revisions in response to comments from the reviewers. And focusing on that peer review stage specifically, as a reviewer, it's important for you to know what type of peer review the journal that you're reviewing for uses, and that you're happy with that approach to peer review. The most common type of peer review which you are likely to encounter is called single blind or single anonymous review. In this model, the reviewers know who the authors are, but the authors don't know who the reviewers are. And although this is the most common approach to peer review in many fields, there are some concerns about whether this approach does enough to prevent potential bias in the process. If the reviewers know who the authors are, then could their identity unfairly affect the reviewer's opinion in any way? One approach to addressing concerns about this potential bias is double-blind or double anonymous peer review, where the authors don't know the identity of the reviewers, and the reviewers also don't know the identity of the authors. The argument for this approach is that the reviewers will assess the article on the basis of the research alone, because they don't know who the authors are. But a study by O'Connor et al. In 2017 highlighted that attempting to hide author identity isn't always that easy. Whether it's writing style or just general knowledge of who is working in what in a niche field, a double-blind review process doesn't always guarantee that reviewers won't be able to guess the identity of an author. And so another approach to address potential bias in peer review is to completely open up the process. In open peer review, reviewers know who the authors are, and once the review process is complete, the authors also know the identity of the reviewers. Some journals also publish the reports written by the reviewers with the published article. And the idea behind this approach is to increase transparency so that everyone knows what the reviewers said about a published paper and who said it. And evidence suggests that reviewers do provide more details to support their comments in open peer review, which can be really beneficial for authors. So in just a moment, I'm going to have a couple of questions for you to answer. In each case, you will see the question with the different responses come up on your screen. Once the poll is live, please select your response, and I'll keep the poll open for 20 to 40 seconds to give lots of people a chance to answer. So the first question is, thinking about your perspective as an author, which of those three approaches to peer review appeals to you more? Is it double anonymous, open, or single anonymous that you prefer as an author? So hopefully the poll is going to be distributed. There we go. I'll just give you a chance to vote in that poll. I'll leave it open a few more seconds. There's a few answers which are swinging backwards and forwards in popularity here. I'll give it a bit longer. Okay. Just going to close this now and share with you what you thought. So as you'll see, for those on the call today who were able to vote, there's a big preference for double anonymous peer review from an author's perspective. Secondary, coming through to open, so both focused on approaches which attempt to address any concerns around bias, with single anonymous review coming through as the least popular of all the options. So that's thinking from the perspective as an author. So the second question is, if you were to think about your role as a reviewer, what do you prefer? So same question, but thinking about it as a peer reviewer, and particularly reflect on whether there's any difference in your response, or if you're thinking the same thing as you do as an author. I'm going to leave this open a bit longer. I want to get to a similar percentage of people voting, otherwise I'm going to be accused of biasing the sample or something. Okay, so I'll close the poll there. So this is actually a really interesting result here because you said almost exactly the same in terms of percentages, and there was about the same percentage of people who participated in the poll. So here, unless you individually swapped and it just swapped around to the same percentages, you're very consistent in terms of your perspective as an author or a reviewer. I don't always see this when I do this poll. I sometimes see a swing from a greater preference towards open peer review as an author through to single anonymous as a reviewer, or even double anonymous, because it can depend on where you are in terms of your role within the process, how happy you are with the reviewer's name being known, for example. So it's great to see such clear consistency between the answers today. So that's just an initial set of thoughts about the types of peer review models which are out there and how we might react to the different models, and making sure that as a reviewer you are happy with whatever model it is that the journal that you're reviewing for is using. So we've covered that introduction to what peer review is. The next question for today is, well, why do we get involved in peer review? Hopefully, because you're at this webinar, you are already convinced that peer review is an important process. Detailed assessment of articles is essential to ensure that what is published is of sufficient quality and can be trusted. And although it can sometimes feel like a very challenging process from an author's perspective, at its best, peer review is more like a conversation between the reviewers, the editor, and the authors, where the research can be discussed and improved upon and effectively communicated to the wider research community. But when we're talking about the different roles involved in peer review, we've mentioned author and reviewer. Editor is the other one who we keep referring to. When we're talking about the editor, who do we mean and who might be involved in this process? Well, different journals will have different editorial structures. On some journals, there might be a single editor-in-chief who handles all aspects of the journal and inviting reviewers, whilst on others there might be subject-specific editors, such as section editors or associate editors, who directly oversee articles within their subject area. Or there might be a guest editor overseeing a subset of articles within a journal. Whichever editor is inviting you as a reviewer, they will likely be primarily looking for potential reviewers by looking through the published literature for people whose publications as an author show that they are an expert in a particular area. Editors might also use other approaches to find potential reviewers, such as searching their journal database or using AI tools. But if they're not already familiar with your expertise as a potential reviewer, then it's likely that they will aim to judge this from what you've published already as an author, or possibly other additional information that they can find about you, maybe on your institutional website or any online profiles. So if you're interested in receiving invitations to review, then it's a good idea to keep your online presence up to date with your expertise and any subject keywords that might describe your research interests. Because editors will be looking for, in potential reviewers, they'll be looking at the experience, the expertise in the number of publications that you might have, and in what particular subject areas. And exactly what the editor's looking for will vary by journal. So it's not a question of saying you need a certain number of publications always to be a peer reviewer. That will vary a lot by editor and by journal and by subject area. The key aspect here is that the editor does need some way of knowing who you are and what your expertise is to be able to review. And when the editor invites someone as a reviewer, they will have some expectations around what the reviewer will bring to that process. And the author and the readers will also have expectations. The editor will hope that the reviewer will provide a report which will give them the information that they need to make a decision on the article, whilst the authors will be looking for constructive and helpful feedback. The readers of the journal will be looking to the reviewers to provide a thorough assessment of the article, which means that they can trust what is published, and so that what is finally published includes all the required information for the work to be clear and understandable. And that really is the primary goal of being involved in peer review, to provide an assessment which helps ensure that well-done research is communicated clearly to those who need that information. But considering all those different expectations which are placed on reviewers, you might be left with the question of, well, why should I be a peer reviewer? Or what benefits do I get from being a peer reviewer? Well, surveys have indicated that the majority of researchers get involved in peer review because they feel that it is part of their role as an academic and due to interest in the articles they're sent to assess. However, there are also some potential direct benefits in terms of the connections which can be made. Many researchers also find that reviewing others' work helps improve their own writing, as it's an opportunity to consider how a reviewer might view your own articles and develop an alternative perspective. It can also be the case that when journals are recruiting for new members of their editorial boards, they will look to those who have been frequent reviewers for them in the past. And in addition to these kind of maybe more indirect benefits, many journals will also provide some recognition to those who are involved with peer review for them. The precise details will depend on the journal, so it is important for you to look either at the journal website or the invitation email for specific information. In general, evidence indicates that direct financial rewards for peer review are not valued by researchers, but journals aim to offer access to journal content or recognition such as published thank you lists, which say just a good thank you to everybody who has reviewed for them within the last year. And as well as offering these kinds of rewards, many journals will also support reviewers in linking their review activity to either their Publons or their ORCID profiles. This enables researchers to share that they've completed a review for a particular journal without sharing the details of the article itself, and it can be a great way to gain recognition for your contribution as a reviewer. So we've covered what peer review is, some of the expectations which are placed on a peer reviewer, and why you might want to get involved in the process. Now we'll jump into a bit more of the detail with what to do when you receive an invitation to review. A review invitation will normally be an email from the journal, and do look closely at that email as it should have all the core information in it which you will require, including the name of the journal, the title and abstract of the article that they want you to assess, and other important information such as the type of peer review and the deadline. So before you agree to review, you should look at all of this information and consider whether you really can review that article. In particular, from the title and abstract and any other information, do you consider that you have the expertise required? I noted earlier that the editor will be aiming to assess your expertise from information like your previous publications or your online profiles. Have they assessed your expertise correctly? Do bear in mind that for some research, such as interdisciplinary research, the editor may have to invite several reviewers to assess different aspects of an article. So do consider whether there's a particular method or technique that the editor may want your views on. And it's also important to consider whether you might have some kind of conflict of interest regarding the article. That is, any connection with the authors, the article, the subject area, or the funding, which could affect your assessment and mean that you cannot provide an unbiased report. And if you can't review for any reason, then it's okay to say no. The editor will of course be hoping that you will accept the invitation, but they would prefer a quick decline rather than a report which does not help them make a decision. And when you respond to that invitation, you may have the option to choose either decline or unavailable. And these will indicate to the editor the different reasons why you had to say no. Decline will indicate to the editor that you would not have agreed to review that article at any time. Maybe your expertise isn't right, or you've got a conflict of interest, which means that you can't review. If you're given the option, it's useful to add some more details as to the reason why you declined, and potentially update your keywords relating to your profile within the journal system or share them with the editor, as that will enable the editors to match you to better papers in the future. Alternatively, if you are saying you are unavailable, then you're indicating to the editor that you would have reviewed this article, but you're just not available to do so right now. This can also be really helpful information for the editor, as they will know that they should consider you for similar articles in the future, or if they're struggling to find reviewers for the current article, they might get back to you with an extended deadline. So when you receive an invitation to review, consider whether there's anything which could bias your review and whether you can review in the time frame expected. It's also important to remember that the review process is confidential from the moment that you receive that invitation. You shouldn't share the details of the article that you've been sent to review with anyone without discussing it with the journal first. And if you want some more detailed guidance on some of the important considerations, then I would recommend that you look at the COPE Ethical Guidelines for Peer Reviewers, which are a really fantastic resource. And if you download the handout, which has the slides for this presentation, then the link in this slide to COPE is clickable. So that should take you straight there. So assuming that you've received your invitation to review and that you have accepted it because everything's okay, you're happy with all the different elements, what next? What's important to look for when you are assessing an article? Well, during the assessment of an article, there will be 4 things which you will broadly be looking at as a peer reviewer. First and most importantly, the validity of the study, whether the research has been soundly conducted and whether the conclusions are appropriate for the results obtained. Second, you'll be looking at the quality of the presentation. Overall, as a reviewer, it's not your responsibility to copy edit the paper, but you should be looking at whether the presentation enables the research to be understood. Third, you will be looking at the contribution of the research to knowledge. Is this work adding to the knowledge of the research community? And finally, some journals may also wish you to comment on the novelty of the research and whether it is a unique contribution. And I very deliberately separated out research significance from novelty here, because a piece of work could be significant if it provides a replication of a previous finding, proving that it's reproducible. That might not count as original, but it's certainly important. And different journals will emphasize different areas that they want you to look at, with some primarily focused on the validity of the research and others wanting more details on originality. But before you start getting into all of those details of the article, it's also important to consider what type of research or what type of article you have been sent to review. It is likely that the majority of articles you receive will be research articles, but whether the research is empirical or theoretical will affect how you consider the article. If you're looking at empirical research where there's been maybe data collection and analysis, then the methods used for that will be a key part of your assessment. By contrast, for theoretical research, the consideration as a reviewer will not be on data collection, but rather on the theoretical framework and the flow of the argument of the paper. Peer review in this theoretical research context is less about verification and more about discussing the concepts or assertions within an article. And although, as I said, many of the articles you receive to review will be research articles, you might also be sent other types of articles to review. And it's important to check exactly what type of article it is before you start, as again, what you want to focus on may be different. If you aren't sure what the requirements are for a particular type of article, then a great resource is the journal's own instructions for authors. These should detail what different types of article the journal considers and any specific points that you might need to think about in your review. For example, if it's a case study type article, then what are the different sections required? If it's an article which gives a study protocol, then you're not expecting any results to be included there. So look at that in advance because it will help you to cover the right details within the review. And the type of article is frequently on the first page of the PDF that you receive to review. So you're taking some time before you get into the detail of the article to think about what type of article you're assessing, the type of research, and getting that overview. And it's a good idea as part of this to also get a sense of the overall flow of the article before you start. Look at some of the key elements, in particular the abstract, the methods and figures if you're assessing empirical research, or maybe the conceptual framework if you're looking at something more theoretical. And look at the conclusions. That should give you an outline of what the paper's focused on and what the final conclusion is that it's coming to. And once you've got that outline, I would then recommend going and reading the paper all the way through once, not going into the detail, but just getting, again, a bit more of a flow, making some brief notes, working out what the key assertions are of the paper. Because once you've got this overview, you'll be able to it'll make it easier for you to go through the paper in more detail, section by section, and doing that more specific, detailed report. So get an overview and then getting into the detail. And that's what we're going to do next, looking a bit more at that assessment of the different sections of an article. So as I mentioned, the type of research that you've been asked to assess will affect what you want to consider as a reviewer. If the research is taking a theoretical approach, then the most important elements will be around the flow of the article. Have the authors placed the study in the appropriate wider context? And is any methodology or approach that they're using expressed in a clear manner? Is there a logical sequence of argument through the article with sufficient detail to support the assertions that the authors are making? And when it comes to their conclusions, are those derived from the main discussion with any limitations or open questions adequately addressed? So those are the kinds of questions that we'll be wanting to think about as a reviewer if you're looking at a piece of theoretical research. For empirical research, where the authors may have conducted experiments and be presenting quantitative data, there are likely to be a clearer set of expectations about the exact structure of the article and the sections that you would expect to see. In the checklist in the handouts section, there are some detailed questions which you can ask yourself for each section of a research paper, as well as questions to address for other types of articles. And overall, the four main sections of an empirical research article, introduction, methods, results, and discussion, from those different sections, you'll be expecting to be able to see why the study was relevant, what the authors did, what they found, and then a balanced discussion, which is based on the results obtained. We don't have enough time today to look at each section in detail, so over the next few slides, I'm going to look really at the method section and what you would want to look for there. But you can apply the same principles and the same questions from the checklist to different sections of an article, because the checklist is broken down section by section. So going into a bit more detail in the methods in particular, you will want to be clear about what the authors did, that the methods were suitable for the research question, and that the study design would not have introduced any bias. On the right-hand side of the slide here, we have the questions from the checklist relating to the methods, which should help you to bring out the key points relating to the sample and approaches used. One important point when assessing the methods is to aim to consider these independently and not consider what the results are yet. The main focus is whether the methods were appropriate for the question asked, not whether you liked the results that they produced. Over the next few slides, I'm going to share some example review comments relating to methods sections. Some of the examples are not exact comments from reviewers, but are based on the kinds of comments that we see. And some of the examples are real reviewer comments from articles in F1000 research. At F1000, the peer review process is fully open and available online, and you can see the reports are all citable. You can click through to any of these links in the presentation afterwards and look at the full report in context. And this is such a great resource for seeing the peer review process happening live, as the responses from the authors are also added as they are updated. So it's continually updating and showing you the latest status with the peer review of that particular article. And in each of these cases, the text in the orange box is the question from our checklist, which might prompt you as the reviewer to make these kinds of comments. So I'm sharing here a few comments on method sections. Some are ones which I've put together based on the kinds of comments that we see, and some are direct examples from F1000 research, which is a fantastic resource because the peer review is fully open and available online. And you can see it happening live. So as the reviews are there, they're all fully citable, and the responses from authors are also there as needed. So yes, if you want to see what's going on in a peer review process, F1000 research is a great place to look. And on this first slide, you'll see that both of the comments are focused on asking the authors to provide more details about the research that has been done. It's a really common request that authors make, and it highlights that as a reviewer, many of the comments that you make to authors are likely to be in the form of questions. So that's a really good way of approaching a review report, because if you're thinking about the questions that you have when you're reading a piece of research, they're likely to be the questions that readers will also have. And so asking those questions and getting the authors to address them in advance can be a great way to make sure that those are then clarified in the final version of the article. And in some circumstances, it may be that as a reviewer, you want to recommend some additional experiments, maybe to fill some gaps in the methodology. The second of these two comments I find particularly interesting, and again, I encourage you after the session to have a look at the full comment in its context by clicking on the link. The comment from the reviewer is very balanced, highlighting that some additional work would improve the study, but also acknowledging that the authors have highlighted the limitation. And this leads us on to a really interesting question of whether you think that it's suitable as a reviewer for you to ask the authors to do additional experiments. And I have another poll question coming up for you, which you might have guessed from the fact that I was starting to pose the question in that way. So I'm going to put the options up here first, and then I'll open the poll in just a moment. So what I have here are several options for when you might feel that it's reasonable for you as a reviewer to ask for additional experiments. You can select more than one when the poll is live, I believe, but these are the different options. So one is that you are curious about the outcome, even though they are beyond the scope of the actual manuscript that's in front of you. A second option, would you ask for additional experiments if the manuscript is missing an experiment that papers on that topic traditionally contain, that the authors haven't used enough samples or replicants in their analysis? Or would you ask for it if increased samples would be better, but even if it requires significant time or funding? So I'm just going to get that poll question live with those options. Okay, just going to let that poll run a little bit. Okay, I'm just going to leave that open for a couple more seconds and then close that and share the outcome that you have given for this. So an overwhelming majority of you selected from the middle two options, with most people selecting the option of that they would ask for additional experiments as a reviewer if there's not enough samples or additional replicants are needed. Yes, I think that's a case where it's very reasonable to ask for additional experiments because there's a question over the soundness of the article without it. Second option that was most popular in this is that there's an experiment missing that papers in that topic traditionally contain. And this, I think, is interesting that we've only got 57% of people who voted who clicked on this one. And I think I agree in that it would depend on exactly the circumstances whether you would ask for this or not. Circumstances where I might is that if it depends on the reason really for why that experiment's normally included. So circumstances where I might is if that experiment is something which always has to lay the groundwork or is a useful control or something like that that really shows the soundness of the current piece of research. But if it's more just, it's tradition that this is included, but it's not really required for the soundness, then do we really need to ask the authors to include it? So I think it depends in that particular option there. The two least popular options are you're curious about the outcome of the experiment, even though it's beyond the scope, and the increased sample being better, but it would take significant time or funding. And again, I agree with the low percentage here. I would be very cautious about asking for additional experiments in either of those cases, because if it's not really required for the soundness of the study, then is it fair to ask the authors to add it? You could, as a reviewer, make a suggestion that it could be interesting, but you'd have to be very clear that it wasn't dependent on that you weren't requiring that be completed in order for the article to be accepted for publication. You could make it as a suggestion. So that's the point about additional experiments. And I just want to close this section of looking at methods by sharing one final example from F1000. And what I've done here is I've put on the slide all of the points raised by the reviewer in this report relating to the methods, and the bold is mine to emphasize key points. Again, you can see that most of these are questions which are asking for more details. And this report is really clear about the types of additional details which they need the authors to include. Again, do take some time after the session to look at this report in more detail at the link. And within empirical research, it might also be that authors are presenting quantitative data, but if you're in social sciences fields or some other fields of research, it's possible that you're receiving an article to review which is presenting qualitative data. For example, results from surveys or focus group type discussions. And a lot of the things that we've talked about already that you need to consider as a reviewer will be similar. But in your analysis of methods in a piece of qualitative research, you'll want to probably focus on some elements such as the sample size, how participants were approached, and whether there could be any bias in the sample. Also looking at the questionnaire or the standard instruments have been used and whether they've been suitably validated. So those are some extra things that you might need to think about if you're looking at qualitative research and you're assessing that type of research. So to close off this section, I just want to direct you to a few additional resources, again with all of the links provided. In addition to the resources that you'll find in the handout section, if you're in a biomedical field, then you may also want to look at the Equator reporting guidelines. These outline the different kinds of information that should be included in articles reporting different types of study, looking at different study designs such as randomized controlled trials or systematic reviews. And these are really useful, again, if you're coming from the perspective of an author trying to think about what to include in your article as you write it up, but it can also be really helpful as a reviewer, as almost a checklist of things that you might want to think about for different types of study. So we've done the overview of where to start when you get an article to review and the kind of detail that you might want to look at, particularly thinking about method sections. So I now want to come on to some of the other common questions which come up in relation to peer review. And one very common question is, as a reviewer, to what extent should you be assessing the language in an article? When you receive an article to review, it is really natural that you will notice errors in spelling or grammar. However, as a reviewer, correcting these aspects of an article shouldn't be your main focus. As long as the research is understandable, the editor needs your expertise on the details of that research, and copy editing can be done later by the journal if needed. If you do have concerns that the language in the article makes the research hard to understand, then you could let the editor know that language revisions are required in your comments. Alternatively, if you're having trouble reviewing due to the language, then you might want to contact the editor in advance and recommend that some language revisions be completed before any further reviewing takes place, as that will enable the research to be more clearly understood. Another question that frequently comes up is what the role of peer review is in detecting unethical behaviour. We've all seen cases where published papers have been retracted due to concerns about data, overlapping with previous work or other issues. And it's hoped that such issues will be identified in advance through assessment processes at the journal. But what's your role specifically as the peer reviewer? Well, overall, again, as a reviewer, you shouldn't feel under undue pressure to identify all the issues relating to potential unethical behaviour. The primary purpose of peer review is to assess the quality and validity of the research presented, and you're not expected to be able to identify all of the different issues that might relate to publication or research ethics. However, it is also the case that as a peer reviewer, you are looking at that article very closely, and it's possible that you will therefore identify problems which others have missed. So it's important to know what you might see and what action you should take. So when we're talking about unethical behaviour, there are two broad areas which are covered. Research misconduct relates to all of the issues around manipulation of data, plagiarism, or not following proper ethical practices in the actual conduct of the research. Publishing misconduct is some of the other areas where authors might submit the same article to two different journals at the same time, or attempt to conceal a conflict of interest. Some of this will not be possible for you to identify as a reviewer, but in some cases you may be able to identify a concern about the images or the data. Or you might know the kinds of research ethics that an author should have gone through and be able to raise a concern there. Or you might have been invited to review the same paper by two different journals at the same time. And if you do see any of these kinds of issues, or you think you have a concern, the key thing to do, the only thing you need to do, is to contact the journal with your concerns. As a reviewer, you should not investigate any potential ethical concern yourself. You should let the journal or the editor know your concerns using neutral language, and then let the journal investigate. If your concern is very immediate, then you might want to email the journal directly. Alternatively, you might include some details in your confidential comments to editors as part of your report. The key responsibility is to let the journal know. You don't need to investigate the problem yourself. So when you're assessing an article, remember to be neutral and to consider the research which is there, not what you would have done instead. Make notes as you go and remember to comment on the good things about the article, as well as the points the authors need to improve. And remember to keep in touch with the journal or editor if you have any concerns or any questions at all, because they're there to help you. So moving along the process, you've assessed the article, you've got all of your notes together, and now it's time to bring them together into your review report. Usually, you will need to complete your review in a review form in the online peer review system for the journal. Even if you plan to write your report and then paste it in, it can be helpful to look at the form in advance so you know exactly what questions the journal wants you to answer. In some cases, review forms may have structured questions which you need to answer, whereas in other cases, there may be free text boxes for comments to the authors and the editors, and then the opportunity to give an overall recommendation. Here, I'm going to primarily focus on how to structure a report where you have free text options for your comments, like the form here. But it is important to look carefully at the requirements of the journal that you are reviewing for. So let's think first about the comments to the authors. If you've been given a free text box to fill in, then it's helpful for both the editor and the author if you give your comments some kind of structure. Some reviewers add headings, some follow a structure but don't explicitly add headings. Either's fine as long as it's clear what you're doing. I would recommend that you start your comments with a brief summary of the research. This helps to focus your review and shows that you've understood the work which has been presented. One approach is then to detail any comments you have as major and minor comments. Major comments would be those significant queries that you have about the article, essential points that the authors need to address before the article can proceed. Maybe there's problems with the study design or issues with the data or analysis. That would all be under major comments. Minor comments would be points which are not essential for the validity or reliability of the study, but which would improve the work. For example, missing references, technical clarifications, or unclear labelling of figures and tables. An alternative approach to structuring your report is to give headings of the different sections of the article and to group comments together which are relevant for each section. That's also a really good approach. But if you do choose to group your comments in that way, then also make it clear for the authors and editors which of the comments are essential to be addressed and which are suggestions or recommendations. And remember that the purpose of the comments to the author is both to help the authors improve their article and give the editor key information about the work so that they can make an informed decision. The comments are addressed to the author, but the editor can also see these comments, so you don't need to repeat all of these comments in the comments to editor box. And when you're writing your comments, consider the fact that you're aiming to be constructive. So think about what will help the author identify what they need to do. Be specific. Refer to page and line numbers within the article so the author knows exactly what you want them to look at. And also consider that the authors are likely to be writing a point-by-point response to your comments, which you might be assessing at re-review. So adding numbers to your comments could be really helpful in continuing that ongoing communication. Here, just coming up on the screen now, is an example of a really clearly structured report using the section headings approach. As you can see, this example starts and also ends with summaries, and there are bullet points for each specific comment, grouped under the different sections of the article. And you can see that there's page and line numbers, which really clearly help the authors identify what they need to do. Moving on to the comments to the editor, these are a separate box from the comments to the author, and they are confidential and will not be passed on to the authors. So they're an opportunity for you as the reviewer to raise any issues that would not be appropriate to raise directly with the author. For example, you could make a more general comment about the suitability of the article for the journal. Or if you have any concerns regarding the ethical aspects of the paper, then you could raise that in the comments to the editor. So bear in mind that the editor can see the comments to authors, so they've got all the information there that you're sharing with the authors, and that this box for confidential comments to the editor is separate, it won't be passed on, so you don't need to duplicate, again, any comments from the comments to author here. The editor can see all the comments to the author already. And don't put anything in the comments to editors which the authors need to address. So don't put here any particular revisions that you need to happen. This space is specifically for issues which should only be raised with the editor. So particularly those issues around ethics, or possibly if there's something that you need to say about the paper that could disclose your identity in an anonymous review process, then that might be something you could put here too. And one extra clarification which is helpful here, which actually often comes up in the questions, so I'll address it now. You don't have to put anything at all in comments to editor. If you've said everything you need to say in the comments to the author and there's nothing extra that you need to add, you can leave this box blank. So when you're completing your comments, it's good to think in this way. Review as you would want to be reviewed. The peer review process can feel very challenging from the perspective of an author, and you will also be receiving many comments on your own work. When you're reviewing, consider what it would be like to receive that report as an author. Would it be helpful and encouraging and help you improve your work? If not, if you feel like it's a comment that you wouldn't want to receive as an author, then don't write it as a reviewer. Address your comment in a different and more constructive way. And in addition to providing comments, Many journals will also ask you to give an overall recommendation on whether the article should be published or not by selecting from a number of different terms. And that's what we're going to cover in this next short section. It will depend, again, on the journal. I said that a lot, but there are quite a lot of variations around different journals and exactly what's present. It will depend on the journal exactly what the recommendation terms are and whether these are seen by the author or just by the editor. But in general, you'll find 4 categories: accept, minor revision, major revision, and reject. Though some journals will also have a reject and resubmit recommendation term or something similar. Read the options carefully, and the key thing is to ensure that your recommendation reflects the types of concerns you have raised in your general comments and indicates to the editor what you think the next step should be. For example, if there are only some minor clarifications required, which you feel that the author could easily address, you'll probably want to make a minor revision recommendation. If you have questions which are essential for the authors to address in order for the article to be considered a sound piece of research, then you may want to recommend major revisions. Whether you recommend minor or major revisions can also be an indication for the editor about the level of further assessment that might be needed after the authors have made the changes, and how confident you are that the article is likely to be suitable for publication. Major revision indicates that you are not sure if the article will be suitable or not, and that the revisions need careful assessment before a final decision is made. Sometimes it can be very difficult to choose between the different recommendations. In particular, between major revision or reject, that can be quite a tricky decision to make. The key question to ask yourself in that case is how long the revisions are likely to take and how reasonable it is that the authors would be able to complete those revisions. For example, if you think that the authors need to do a small additional experiment, but it would be relatively quick and easy to complete and that they're likely to have the resources to be able to do it, then major revisions would be a reasonable recommendation. However, if there was a problem, which meant that a major part of the article needed redoing, which might take more than 1 month, or where the authors might not be able to make the change, then recommending rejection would be suitable. Essentially, if you think that the authors could make the changes within around 1 month, then revisions is fair, and if you think it might take longer or additional resource, then you might want to consider a reject and resubmit. And as I said, the key thing is that your recommendation should make sense given the comments that you've given. So in this example, the comments and the recommendation don't match up. The reviewer has ticked reject and resubmit, but if you look at the comments, then there's only really minor comments about the references and something else about the manuscript should have been prepared according to the author guidelines. That doesn't really seem enough to justify a reject and resubmit decision. So there's a mismatch here. Alternatively, there's an example coming up now of a report from F1000 where the reviewer has recommended approval of the article with no changes. When there are no changes to recommend, sometimes reviewers just give editors 1 line of feedback saying that everything's fine, which can leave editors and authors wondering if the reviewer really read the work or not. In this example, which I share a lot because I think it's brilliant, the reviewer has taken the time to give some comments on the positive aspects of the work, which is very encouraging for the author, but also demonstrates that the reviewer has read and understood the article. so it's clear that their recommendation is based on a really thorough assessment. So coming towards the very end of this process now, you've written your report, you've made your recommendation. What happens next? Well, as I mentioned earlier, all the reports will then be sent to the editor, and they will make their decision on the article. And it's important to remember that whatever your recommendation, the editor will make the final decision on the next steps. That recommendation or outcome may be in agreement with what you said in your recommendation, or the editor may decide that the authors should be given the opportunity to revise when you recommended reject. The editor will be considering the views and comments of all the reviewers, as well as their own assessment and their knowledge of the journal. So don't be offended if they do decide something different to you. If you have concerns that the editor missed something important, then you can always contact them afterwards and ask them for more information about their decision. And maybe they'll give you that extra explanation for you as a reviewer. And everything that we've talked about so far has been focused on the first time that you see a particular article for review. However, after the authors have responded to your comments and made revisions, the editor may ask you to re-review to see whether your concerns have been addressed. At this stage of the review process, the focus should be on assessing the author's response to the original concerns. So it's best if you, as the original reviewer, are able to do this. The editor doesn't want to have to find new reviewers at this stage, and you should consider it as part of your original commitment to review. And if you're asked to re-review an article, then in addition to the revised version, you should also be given access to the author's response to reviewers, which will often be in the format of a point-by-point response. That means that each comment made by the reviewer should have an answer from the authors, including an indication of what has been changed in the article. In addition to checking whether the authors have replied to your comments, it's also important at re-review to check that they have made the suitable changes in the article. Otherwise, readers will have the same questions that you had when you read the article for the first time. And on this slide, you can see a comment and a response for an article in F1000 Research, where the author has provided an explanation. Remember that if the author has not made a change that you asked for, then assess their explanation neutrally and don't take it personally. They might have a good explanation for doing something different. Also, don't raise new concerns at re-review unless it is about something that is either very critical to the soundness of the article or you could not have seen it in the first review. For example, if the authors added an experiment or explanation in revisions. As an author, you don't want to be stuck in a cycle of continually responding or changing reviewer comments, which you could have addressed in the earliest version of your revisions. So as a reviewer, agree to re-review and focus on the changes made so you're not putting authors in that position. And so we're coming to the end of our presentation now. And closer to our Q&A, do put some questions in the Q&A box if you haven't done so already. And while you do that, I just want to summarise the top 10 tips of being an effective reviewer, which if you take nothing else away from this session, I would want you to take away these tips. First of all, it's okay to say no to an invitation. Editors will hope for you to say yes, but if you cannot review, then they would rather know that quickly. If you do agree to review, then start by getting an overview and then get into the details, paying particular attention to the methods and the data. Clearly structure your report, starting with a summary and make it clear which of your comments are essential for the authors to address. And when you're writing your report, think about what it would be like for you to receive that report as an author. Is it clear? And review as you would want to be reviewed. And finally, if you have any particular problems or questions, get in touch with the journal, as they are there to help you. And so that brings us on to the Q&A. Apologies again for the slight interruption in the screen share earlier on.
Thank you so much. As I've been saying in individually answering some of the Q&As by text, this will be made available after the fact, both the recording and the presentation, which should already be one of the 3 handouts in a very similar format. Some of you may have noticed that if I haven't answered your question in the Q&A box, I've been saving it to ask to Diana. So if I have given you an answer, maybe for some of the simpler questions, I hope that's been useful. I'm just going to pop out my existing Q&A list here. You should also have access to that, Diana. I would just be thrilled to go through and maybe read off some of those myself. If this works for you, let's just jump right in and ask about, can you talk about any of the financial aspects of reviewers? Are reviewers paid? One of the attendees writes.
That's a really good and common question. In general, reviewers are not directly paid for completing a peer review, and it's assumed that peer review should be part of general academic work. There's also a number of surveys do kind of suggest that many reviewers wouldn't want to accept payment for being a peer reviewer, though I would say that this is certainly a topic which we could spend an entire Q&A talking about, because there's plenty of arguments about the time that it takes to peer review and how reviewers are compensated for that, how peer review is acknowledged as an academic contribution within universities. But there's also questions about ethics here. If review was paid for, then would there be concerns about people agreeing to review maybe something's a bit not quite perfectly within their subject area? So in short, generally, reviewers are not directly paid for review contributions, and other approaches are taken to say thank you or to give incentives or rewards for that review process. But it should hopefully be part of your general academic interactions.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question that came in earlier during the presentation is if you could just elaborate or expand a little bit more on validity. So for example, the term rigor.
Yes, so it's tricky because I'm trying to use some very general terms here because I know that there's lots of different subject areas on the call. And I also know that although some of us might see these as general terms, in some subject areas, validity and rigor are very specific. Essentially, when I'm mentioning things around validity or rigor, I'm talking about, is this a trusted piece of work? If you were to have, if this was to be out as a published piece of research within your field, is it something which could reliably be used to build future research on? Do you think that it's thorough? Does it cover the correct points that it needs to? That's kind of what I'm getting at when I talk about validity and rigor. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
I'm just going to keep going here, and I encourage everyone to continue submitting questions. There was a very useful checklist that I'll be happy to share that URL in the chat if I can get it briefly, but it's definitely part of one of the handout files right now that mirrors closely your presentation. Are there any additional checklists for other knowledge areas? For example, management in this particular Asper's case?
So that checklist, it probably has a bit more of a STEM subjects feel to it, but in general, it is also trying to ask quite general questions about how the kind of things that you want to think about as a peer reviewer. So things to query, things to talk about and to go through. So there isn't another checklist that's very subject focused, but hopefully that checklist could give you an idea of the kinds of questions you might want to think about in the broad areas. It may also depend on the journal. For some journals, they will have very specific checklists as well, which are usually more subject specific that they might want you to look at.
Okay, great, thank you. Someone asks, what if after acceptance of peer reviewing, we are found to be not familiar with some aspects and methodologies in the manuscript?
That's a really good question. If you accept a review and then you find that you, for whatever reason, find that there's some elements which you can't cover, then there's two options. If there are things that you feel you can still assess, and remember I was saying about interdisciplinary papers, it might be that the editor has asked you to review a very particular part of the article, so focus on that. If there's some sections that you can't cover, but you can cover others, assess what you can and then let the editor know. This is a really good use of confidential comments to editors, actually. Let the editor know what you couldn't assess. So particularly, I think very commonly, it would be if there's a statistical test, for example, you've been asked to assess an article and that stats test isn't quite in your area, put it in the confidential comments to editors. Let them know that you couldn't assess that so that they can follow up and maybe get a different reviewer. If you do accept a review and then you find actually it's a really long way from your area, then contact the editor, let them know. They may close down that invitation to you to review and find somebody different. And it's much better for them if you let them know quickly rather than kind of waiting or just not returning your report. Better to contact the editor and let them know.
The next question is, could there be or is there feedback for reviewers on the quality of their review, either by the editor or the authors?
That depends quite a lot. Usually the authors don't have any opportunity to give feedback, again, because the process being confidential, there isn't a kind of two-way direction for that feedback. It depends on the editor. Sometimes editors do give some feedback to reviewers. And you could always ask as well. I mean, again, if you put in your confidential comments to editors that you would really appreciate their feedback on whether this report was useful, they might not, they might decide not to get back to you with that. But I'm getting a lot of feedback from editors that actually they really value that back and forth with reviewers. And if you're actively asking them for feedback, then that can be a great opportunity to increase your interaction.
As you're answering one question I ask, we get several more coming in. So if you have time, I'm happy to continue asking some more. And then you should also have access to the list. So if there's any that jump out at you, I'll invite you to jump right to that yourself. Someone asks, this is a very interesting question, should an author ever be afraid or be thinking in different ways that a reviewer may try to reject their work so that the reviewer themselves can then work on and publish in that same topic?
That's a really good question. And in the presentation I covered, as a reviewer, you might see potential unethical behaviour on behalf of authors. From that perspective, if a reviewer were to do that, then that would be a publishing misconduct on the part of the reviewer. So as an author, hopefully you shouldn't be afraid of that, because actually the vast majority of people who get involved in peer review are doing so because they want their field to advance. And it's an opportunity to have that really good interaction. But if you're concerned as an author that a review process might be being delayed for any reason, and you're concerned about whether this might be going on, or if you're concerned that the reject decision isn't fair, that you feel that reviewers missed the point, or if you later do have concerns that something like this has happened, then the key thing again is to get in touch with the journal and let them know. Use neutral language so that you're not you're just giving the facts and the information to the journal so they can investigate. But that's something that certainly, if there were concerns which were kind of being validated, then the journal would follow up on that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to jump around, not necessarily going chronological order, but if I see a question related to a comment you may have just made. So someone asks, sometimes authors make appeals when they disagree with a review. What then happens to the reviewer?
Well, again, I mean, provided that the reviewer has just given a kind of a reasonable, fair, and from the reviewer's perspective, has done a neutral and unbiased report, then again, most of this should all happen in a very neutral conversation. So if the reviewer's done a fair, constructive, reasonable report, if the editor has made a reject decision and the author has then appealed that, then the editor may or may not change their decision. They may ask for some clarifications for different points from the reviewers, but all of that's a discussion. So there's not really a question of anything happening to the reviewer. It doesn't reflect badly on the reviewer because they've given a fair opinion on the work. In cases where what I was just talking about, where there might be concerns that a reviewer has used the review process as a way to maybe unfairly advantage themselves, then that would usually, if a journal has concerns, that would probably go to the individual's institution, which is the usual way that sort of publishing ethics issues are handled. But yeah, normally nothing happens to the reviewer because you've just given your fair assessment, and then the final outcome is just a discussion on the outcome of that.
Is it possible to contact the journal to show interest in reviewing articles if they haven't proactively reached out to you to invite you?
Yes, you can do. Many editors are looking for new peer reviewers. So if there's a journal that you're particularly interested in reviewing for, then yes, you can email them, let them know that you're interested. If you do that, make sure that you share enough information so that the editor knows who you are. Again, as I was saying earlier, they're going to need to judge who you are and your expertise to review. So make sure that you've given them that information so that they know what kind of papers they might invite you for.
That's a great segue. Another viewer submits a comment saying, as an editor, it has been increasingly difficult to find appropriate reviewers for some manuscripts. Many don't even is this a shared problem, and if so, are there any?
Sorry, my audio broke up a little bit then. That was the editor question.
Yes, let's see. So I want to thank Marcella for submitting that question.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I can read it off the screen now as well. Yes, so yes, it can be very difficult to find reviewers for some articles. Yes, and many people don't reply, or I know that for some editors it can be increasingly a problem of reviewers agreeing to review and then maybe not returning a report. This is absolutely a shared problem that I think lots of journals see. I mean, I hope that this kind of training does go some way to help with it, so that those being invited to review can have a bit more confidence about what they should be looking at and how they should be responding to journals. Simple things like encouraging your institutions, anybody who's a researcher, encouraging your institutions, IT departments to help emails from peer review systems reach the relevant reach your inbox is important, because I know, again, sometimes emails from peer review systems can get caught in spam filters, and that can be a really big problem. So sometimes reviewers haven't even got the invitation to review. So making sure that all of that is available as much as possible is really important, just trying to encourage your institutions to make that available. And the other thing is to increase the diversity of peer reviewers that you're inviting. Certainly something that we see is that those who get invited to peer review a lot, those researchers from North America, from Western Europe, they can be receiving a lot of invitations and be less keen to accept an invitation to review. Whereas if you reach out to some more diverse locations, then you might be more likely to receive that confirmation. So yes, that can be another way to increase your agreement of people reviewing, is to go for greater diversity of reviewers.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to get a few more questions out. I know we're basically running against the ceiling of time here, so feel free to be brief in your answer if you'd like. Someone asks about what do you want to see to be sure that the author is using images without copyright issues?
Good question. I think look to see if it looks like it's something that the author has generated themselves. If it's not, if it's from a previous publication or from any other source, then any declarations regarding usage and copyright should be in the figure legend. And if it is copyrighted, it should be clearly stated that they have permission for reuse.
Okay, I may have to reach out to the asker of this question for clarification, but tell me if you can use this. So how does one know if an old reference is no longer used in a research line of a specific method for a methodology? And any pending questions, I'm happy to get in touch by email to try to help get answers.
Yeah. So for the reference question and whether you know if it's in use or not, I mean, I think that's quite field dependent. I don't think there's any sort of general way of knowing whether references are still relevant or not. It would be up to your knowledge of a field as a reviewer, and knowing kind of which references are usually used for particular techniques.
Okay. So I think there's a few questions. I don't know if you want to review, then, to see any ones you have an immediate answer to. I'll try my best to reach out to some of those remaining questions to make sure I can connect with the askers. And other than that, I think this will be a good time to wrap up in a moment or two.
Yep, so there is a question about if as an author you see that there's been a replication study published of something that hasn't cited the original work, what to do. Should you write to the editor-in-chief or contact the publishing institution? Either, yes. I mean, contacting the journal is the best approach in those cases if you are concerned that an important citation has been missed from an article. Again, phrase it neutrally and give them all of the details that they need to investigate. Another similar question in terms of identifying an issue. If plagiarism is detected, how to proceed? Again, as a reviewer, you don't need to run plagiarism software or anything on an article. The journal will do that if required. But if you're concerned that you might be seeing similarity, let the journal know so they can investigate.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, you've been very generous with your time. I look forward to working on this audio recording and video recording, making it available tonight, and everyone will get it via an automated email from the GoToWebinar platform tomorrow. So with that, on behalf of EURAXESS North America and LAC, we'd like to thank you for attending. As I said earlier, we want to hear from you, so please be in touch with your local EURAXESS hub, whether it is Latin America and the Caribbean or us in North America. You can subscribe to our bi-monthly flash note emails with funding, news, and events. Visit our homepage and see our job portal, and then follow us on social media. As mentioned, you'll get that email tomorrow. You're welcome to send us messages in the meantime with any additional questions, and I'll be happy to make sure in tomorrow's email you get a link to the October 26th edition, the fifth and final in this Taylor and Francis How to Get Published series. So thank you all for attending, for your questions, and thank you, Dr. Dana Marshall, for being here today and giving us this expert presentation.
Thank you.
With that, I'll close out. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.